Billionaire's mother pretends to be a maid to test son's fiancé. The air in the small village was thick with the scent of burning firewood, and the evening sun cast long shadows across the narrow dirt roads. The houses were simple, made of mud bricks with tin roofs that rattled when the wind picked up. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where traditions held power, and where mistakes, especially those of young women, were rarely forgiven. At just 19 years old, Lena found herself sitting alone outside her family's small home, her hands trembling as she clutched her belly. A storm raged inside her heart, even as the night remained calm. Just a few days ago, her world had been simple. She had been a young woman in love, dreaming of a future filled with happiness and stability. But all of that had shattered when she told Daniel, the man she had loved with every piece of her soul, that she was carrying his child. His reaction was not what she had expected. Instead of joy, there was disbelief in his eyes. Then anger. Then a cold, hollow silence that made her stomach churn. "I can't do this, Lena," he had finally said, stepping away from her as if her very presence burned him. "I'm not ready to be a father. I have my own future to think about." His words had hit like a dagger to her chest, cutting through the fragile hope she had clung to. She had tried to reason with him, begged him to stay, but he had already made up his mind. With a final glance, one that lacked any remorse, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone under the vast sky, the stars witnessing the moment her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She had hoped, prayed, that her parents would support her. But when she gathered the courage to tell them the truth, her father's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "You have brought shame upon this family," he thundered, his voice laced with disappointment. Her mother, though clearly torn, stood silent, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. Tears blurred Lena's vision as she fell to her knees, pleading, "Please, I need you. I don't have anyone else." But tradition was stronger than love in this village, and in their eyes, she had committed the ultimate sin, bearing a child without a husband. Within days, her father's decision was final. She was disowned. The villagers whispered, their cruel words echoing in the wind. "Who will marry a girl like that? She's ruined herself. A single mother? She'll never survive on her own." Their words cut deep, but none as painfully as her own father's when he said, "From this day forward, you are no longer my daughter." That night, with a small, tattered bag slung over her shoulder, Lena left everything she had ever known. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a plan. But she had no choice, she had to fight for her child. The journey was harder than she had imagined. She walked for hours, her feet blistered and sore, her heart heavy with grief. Every step away from her home felt like she was walking into the unknown. A vast and merciless world waiting to swallow her whole. Eventually, she arrived in a small, unfamiliar town, miles away from the village that had cast her out. The streets were busier, filled with merchants calling out their prices, people moving in all directions, and the scent of freshly baked bread mixing with the scent of the harsh city life. It was nothing like the quiet village she had grown up in. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Lena tried desperately to find work, but her growing belly made it difficult. "I need someone strong," one man had told her when she asked for a cleaning job, his gaze flickering to her stomach before shaking his head. Another employer had sighed apologetically. "We can't take someone who'll be needing maternity leave soon," he had said. Each rejection stung deeper than the last. But Lena refused to give up. She scrubbed floors in back alleys, washed clothes for strangers, and even sold fruits in the local market. Despite the long hours under the blistering sun, each coin she earned felt like a victory, a step toward the promise she made to the tiny life growing inside her. "I will protect you. I will take care of you. You will have a better life than I did." Months passed, and the pain of being abandoned was slowly replaced with something stronger, determination. Then, on a cold, rainy evening, her world changed forever. Lena's labor pains came suddenly, seizing her body with unbearable force. She barely made it to the town's small clinic, where the midwives rushed to help her. The pain was overwhelming, but she pushed through it, sweat and tears mixing on her face as she clung to the edge of the bed. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, a newborn's cry filled the air. A cry that brought Lena back to life. She looked down at the small, fragile child in her arms, his tiny hands curled into fists. his little chest rising and falling with each breath. "You're here," she whispered, pressing a trembling kiss to his forehead. "My sweet, sweet boy." She named him Ethan. At that moment, every pain, every struggle, every rejection she had faced faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the tiny baby in her arms, the only family she had left. As she held him, she made a silent vow. "I will never let you feel unloved. I will never let you feel unwanted. No matter what, I will protect you." She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Ethan. And that was a battle she would never, ever lose. This is just the beginning of Lena's story, a tale of resilience, love, and sacrifice. If you believe in the strength of a mother's love, drop a in the comments. If you've ever faced a struggle and fought your way through it, share your story. We stand together in the face of adversity. Just like Lena. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because her journey is far from over. And what's coming next will leave you speechless. The small town had been kind to Lena, but kindness did not fill empty stomachs. Nor did it shield her from the relentless struggles of single motherhood. The months after Ethan's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and determination. The nights were the hardest. Ethan would wake up crying, his tiny body trembling with hunger. She would rock him gently, whispering lullabies in a voice made weak by fatigue. Some nights, she had to drink water just to silence the gnawing hunger in her stomach, choosing to save the last bits of food for her son. But despite the exhaustion, despite the overwhelming burden on her young shoulders, Lena never wavered. She had promised Ethan a life where he would never feel abandoned. And she intended to keep that promise, even if it meant pushing herself past her limits. She took up more jobs, working in the market during the day and sewing clothes late into the night. Her hands were always sore, her back always aching, but she never complained. Every coin she earned was carefully saved for Ethan's future. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. The town's economy was harsh, and prices for food and medicine only seemed to rise. Some nights, she sat by the dim candlelight, staring at the few crumpled bills in her hands, her heart sinking. How much longer can I keep going like this? Then, one cruel winter night, fate tested her again. It had been a particularly cold day, and Lena had worked longer than usual, washing clothes for a wealthy family on the other side of town. By the time she returned to her tiny home, her limbs ached, her fingers stiff from the icy water. She hurried inside, expecting to see Ethan asleep in his crib. But the moment she touched his forehead, a deep sense of dread overtook her. He was burning up. "Ethan?" she whispered, gently shaking him. His little body was too hot, his breath shallow. Panic surged through her veins. She scooped him up and rushed into the night, her heart hammering in her chest. The town's clinic was closed. Lena pounded on the door, her voice shaking as she pleaded for someone to help her son. But there was no answer. The next closest hospital was in the next town, and it would take at least an hour on foot. She didn't have a carriage. She didn't have the money for a ride. But she had legs. So she ran, through the freezing night, with the cold biting at her skin. She clutched Ethan tightly against her chest, whispering prayers between desperate gasps for air. "Hold on, my love, just hold on a little longer." She ran until her legs gave out, her knees slamming into the icy ground. A carriage screeched to a stop nearby, and an old woman leaned out, her eyes filled with concern. "My dear, what's wrong?" "My son," Lena panted, barely able to speak. "He's burning up. I need to get him to the hospital." Without hesitation, the woman helped her into the carriage. When they arrived, the doctors took Ethan from her arms and disappeared behind large white doors. Lena stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands still frozen in the shape of holding him. Minutes passed, then hours. She could hear every second tick by, each one stretching the space between her and the moment she would know if her son would live. Finally, the doctor emerged, his face unreadable. "He's stable," he said. Lena collapsed into the nearest chair, tears slipping down her cheeks in silent relief. But the doctor's voice was firm when he spoke again. "Your son has a severe infection. He needs strong antibiotics, and those aren't cheap." Her heart stopped. Money. The very thing she never had enough of. Lena begged. She told them she would work, she would clean the hospital, scrub floors, do anything, if they could just save her son. The doctor hesitated. Then, finally, He sighed. "We can give him the medicine," he said, "but you must pay the debt back in full within 3 months." Lena nodded furiously, not caring how impossible it sounded. "I will. I promise." Ethan would live, and that was all that mattered. The next 3 months were a war. Lena worked day and night, taking on every job she could find. She stopped eating proper meals, surviving on scraps and tea so she could save every coin for Ethan's medical bills. She even considered borrowing money. But the town's lenders were merciless. Their interest rates were so high that she knew she would be selling her soul if she agreed. One night, as she sat at the marketplace, her fingers blistered from sewing for hours straight, she overheard a conversation between 2 vendors. "There's a rich man in town," one of them whispered. "They say he's looking for a housemaid. The pay is good." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "A rich man?" She turned, her heart pounding. "Who is he?" she asked quickly. The vendor looked at her, surprised. "You don't know? He's Christopher Sterling, the wealthiest businessman in the region. Owns factories, real estate, you name it. But they say he's ruthless." Lena didn't care about ruthless. She cared about survival. She found the mansion the very next day and begged for the job. The butler eyed her suspiciously. But when she told him she was willing to work for whatever wage they offered, he let her in. And just like that, Lena became a maid in the house of a billionaire. Working in the Sterling mansion was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The halls were lined with gold-trimmed furniture. The chandeliers glittered with real diamonds. And the people inside moved with the air of those who had never known hunger. But Lena wasn't here to admire the luxury. She was here to survive. She worked from dawn until well past midnight, scrubbing, dusting, and keeping her head down. The other servants whispered that Mr. Sterling was rarely home, always off on business. But one evening, as she carefully arranged flowers in the grand foyer, a deep voice startled her. "Who are you?" Lena turned quickly, her breath catching as she found herself staring into the eyes of Christopher Sterling himself. He was younger than she expected, in his mid-30s, with piercing blue eyes and an aura of quiet authority. His presence alone commanded the room. I'm Lena, sir," she stammered, "the new maid." For a moment, he simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Carry on." She thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Christopher Sterling noticed everything. And he was about to notice her, too. Lena had entered this mansion thinking it was just a job, just a means to an end. But fate had other plans. Because behind these golden walls, secrets lay buried. Because Christopher Sterling was not just a rich man. He was connected to her past in ways she never could have imagined. Because soon, Lena would have to choose between protecting her heart or saving her son. And when the truth finally came out, nothing would ever be the same again. Lena never imagined that survival could feel this endless. Each day in the Sterling mansion was a test of endurance. The work was relentless, scrubbing the marble floors until her fingers ached, washing linens in scalding water, and ensuring that every corner of the mansion gleamed with perfection. The other maids warned her that Christopher Sterling did not tolerate failure. She had only seen him once, the moment she was hired. He had studied her with piercing blue eyes before turning away as if she were just another fixture in his world of luxury. Lena didn't care. She wasn't here to impress him. She was here to save her son. But the reality of that promise was starting to take its toll. Every morning, Lena rose before the sun, walking miles to the hospital before her shift began, just to see Ethan. She couldn't afford to keep him in a private room, so he shared a crowded ward with other sick children. Some days, when she walked in, she feared he wouldn't wake up. But Ethan was a fighter. He would smile weakly as she arrived, lifting his tiny hands toward her. "Mama?" And every time, Lena's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the same breath. "I'm here, my love," she would whisper, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "I'll always be here." But she didn't have long to stay. She had to work. At the mansion, Lena was given the hardest tasks, the ones that the other servants avoided. She never complained, even when her hands bled from scrubbing the grand staircase, even when she collapsed from exhaustion, only to be woken up by another order. Even when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Porter, seemed to have a personal vendetta against her. "You're too slow, Lena," Mrs. Porter would snap, watching her dust the expensive bookshelves. "If you can't keep up, there are plenty of women who would take your place." Lena bit her tongue. She had no choice but to endure. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the distance from Ethan. Every day, she felt like she was being torn in two. Part of her was here, in this cold, unforgiving mansion. The other part was back at the hospital, by her son's side, holding his fragile hands, whispering to him that things would get better. But what if they didn't? One evening, as she finished folding linens, her world nearly collapsed. A nurse from the hospital had called. Ethan had taken a turn for the worse. Lena's hands shook as she hung up. She needed to see him now. But her shift wasn't over. She rushed to Mrs. Porter. "Please, I need to leave early. It's my son, he's sick. He's in the hospital." Mrs. Porter barely looked up from her ledger. "You're needed here." Lena felt like she had been punched in the chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just an hour." Mrs. Porter sighed dramatically. "If you leave now, you'll lose your position here." Lena's heart stopped. Lose her job? That meant no money, no medicine, no way to pay for Ethan's care. She couldn't risk it, so she stayed. And that night, as she finished polishing the dining table, she wept silently, her tears falling onto the expensive wood, praying, begging Ethan to hold on just a little longer. The next morning, Lena worked mechanically, her emotions locked deep inside. She carried a heavy tray of silverware into the dining hall when her body suddenly gave out. Her legs buckled. The tray crashed to the floor, the sound echoing through the grand room. Lena barely registered the gasps around her, only the burning shame and exhaustion that swallowed her whole. Then a voice, deep and sharp as steel, cut through the air. "What's going on here?" Lena froze. It was him, Christopher Sterling. The entire room fell silent as he stepped forward, his piercing eyes scanning the mess on the floor before landing on her. Lena couldn't meet his gaze. She dropped to her knees, gathering the silverware with trembling hands. I'm sorry, sir." Christopher crossed his arms. "You're new, aren't you?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." He stared at her for an uncomfortably long moment before speaking. "You look like you're about to collapse." "I'm fine, sir." His gaze narrowed. "Are you?" Lena didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. After a moment, he turned to Mrs. Porter. "Give her a break." Mrs. Porter stiffened. "Sir, I won't have staff collapsing in my house," he said curtly. "She can rest." Then, without another word, he walked away. Lena didn't know what to feel. But for the first time since she arrived, someone had noticed her struggle. Days later, the hospital called again. This time, it was urgent. Ethan needed an immediate procedure. Lena didn't hesitate. She ran from the mansion, not caring if she lost her job. Her son came first. By the time she arrived at the hospital, she was out of breath, her entire body trembling. She rushed into Ethan's room, her heart pounding. He was so small, so fragile, hooked up to machines. Her knees buckled as she reached him. "My baby," she whispered, stroking his forehead. "I'm here." The doctor approached her. "The procedure can save his life." But Lena looked up, fear gripping her heart. "But we need an immediate payment to begin." Her breath caught. "Money. Always money." Lena looked at Ethan, his small hands, his pale cheeks. She wouldn't let him die because she was poor. She stood abruptly, her mind racing. She needed to find a way. Now, she rushed back to the mansion. She wasn't supposed to enter the main study. But she didn't care. She burst through the doors. Christopher Sterling looked up, startled. "What the? Please," Lena gasped. "I need help." His expression darkened. "You barged in here without permission?" Lena dropped to her knees. "My son is dying." Christopher froze. Lena's voice shook as she continued. "He needs treatment. I'll work for you for free. For years. Just, please, help me save him." The room fell silent. Then Christopher stood. "What hospital?" Lena's breath hitched. "The public hospital in town." Christopher grabbed his coat. "Let's go." Lena stared, unable to process what was happening. "Sir, you don't have to. I don't leave children to die," he said firmly. "Now come on." Lena felt like the air had rushed from her lungs. And as she followed him, she realized that her life was about to change forever. Lena thought she had come to this mansion to work. But fate had other plans. Because Christopher Sterling wasn't just her employer, he was about to become the person who would change her world forever. And when the truth of their connection finally unraveled, Nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of deception settled heavily on Lena's shoulders as she continued her role as the unnoticed maid. For weeks, she had scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and endured insults and humiliation, all in the name of one thing: protecting her son from a disastrous mistake. She had seen enough. Jane, the woman who claimed to love Henry, was not who she pretended to be. Lena had watched in silence as Jane treated the staff like dirt, dismissing their efforts as if they were nothing. She had been scolded, called useless, and even had a drink spilled on her, just because Jane was in a bad mood. Through it all, Lena bit her tongue, held back her tears, and reminded herself of her mission. She wasn't just anyone. She was Henry's mother. And no matter how hard Jane tried to humiliate her, Lena would not break. But tonight was different. Tonight, Lena would finally see just how far Jane was willing to go for wealth and status. The Sterling mansion was alive with celebration. The dining hall glittered under a cascade of golden lights. A long table was set with crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and plates adorned with exquisite cuisine that only the wealthiest could afford. Henry had invited friends, business partners, and family members, everyone who mattered in his world. And at the head of the table sat Jane, her makeup flawless, her designer dress hugging her perfect figure. Lena, still disguised as the maid, stood in the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She already knew what was coming. Henry was going to propose. But before that happened, she needed to see Jane's true colors one last time. And so, as she moved around the room, serving guests and refilling glasses, she paid close attention. As the night wore on, Jane's patience with the help wore thin. Lena stepped forward to pour her a drink, but as she reached for the glass, her hand trembled ever so slightly. The exhaustion of long hours, lack of sleep, and the overwhelming burden of secrecy had finally begun to take its toll. Jane noticed, and instead of kindness, instead of even basic decency, she lashed out. "Oh my God," Jane sneered, pulling her hand away dramatically. "You nearly spilled that on me. You idiot." Lena froze, her cheeks burning with shame as murmurs spread through the table. Some guests looked away, embarrassed by Jane's rudeness. Others chuckled softly, amused by the way she was treating a mere maid. Henry's expression darkened, but before he could speak, Jane continued, her voice sharp and condescending. "You're lucky you even have a job." She snapped. "Honestly, Henry, you need to fire some of these people. They can't even serve a drink properly." Lena clenched her jaw. She wanted to scream, to reveal the truth right then and there, but she held back. She needed to hear more. She needed to see just how deep Jane's selfishness ran. So she bowed her head, whispered a meek, "I'm sorry," and stepped away. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The room fell into a hushed silence when Henry stood up, clearing his throat. Lena watched as he reached into his pocket, his hands slightly trembling. Then, slowly, he pulled out a small velvet box. The air felt thick with anticipation. Jane's eyes sparkled, her lips parting in excitement. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Henry took a deep breath, his gaze flickering toward Lena for a split second before he turned back to Jane. "Jane," he said, his voice steady but his eyes unreadable. "You mean a lot to me. These past few months have been wonderful. And I've seen how much you care about me." Jane beamed. Lena held her breath. Henry slowly got down on one knee. And then, he spoke the words that would change everything. "But before I ask you this important question," he continued, "I have to be sure of one thing." Jane blinked, her smile faltering just slightly. "What do you mean?" Henry gestured toward Lena. "I want you to apologize to my maid." The room went dead silent. Jane's smile vanished completely. "Excuse me?" she scoffed, glancing at Lena like she was nothing more than an insect beneath her shoe. "You heard me," Henry said calmly, but his gaze was sharp. "I saw the way you treated her earlier. I saw how you've been treating the staff since you moved in. And I need to know, do you have the humility to apologize?" Jane laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You're kidding, right?" Henry didn't blink. "I'm not." Jane crossed her arms, her expression darkening. "Henry, she's just a maid. Why should I apologize? I mean, it's not like she's important." Lena felt her stomach twist painfully at those words. Not important. That was how Jane saw people who had less than her. Not as human beings. Not as people with emotions. with struggles, with worth. Just background characters in her world of luxury. Henry exhaled slowly. And then, in front of everyone, he did something no one expected. He closed the ring box. I see, he said quietly, standing up. Then I'm afraid I can't do this. Jane's face turned ghostly pale. What? She stammered. Henry, what are you saying? Henry pocketed the ring, his voice calm but firm. I'm saying that I won't marry someone who has no kindness in her heart. Gasps erupted around the table. Jane's eyes widened, panic setting in. Henry, wait, she reached for his arm. But he pulled away. I needed to be sure, he said, his voice laced with disappointment. And now I am. Jane's composure shattered. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, looking around the room desperately. You're throwing away our future over some stupid maid? And then, before anyone could stop her, Jane turned furiously toward Lena. You, she hissed, stepping closer. You ruined everything. You. Enough. Henry's voice boomed through the room, stopping her in her tracks. Jane turned back to him, eyes wide with desperation. Henry, please. But Henry had already made up his mind. He turned toward Lena. And then, in a moment that would change everything, he reached for her hand. I'd like you to meet someone. Jane, Henry said, his voice eerily calm. Jane's brows furrowed. What? Henry glanced at Lena. This is my mother. Silence. Absolute silence. Jane's face drained of color as she staggered back. Why your mother? She choked out. Lena finally straightened her back, stepping forward. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than ever. And I have seen exactly the kind of person you are. Tears burned in Jane's eyes. She turned to Henry one last time. Henry, please, don't do this. But it was over. Henry shook his head. You were never in love with me, he said softly. You were in love with what I could give you. And just like that, Jane's golden future shattered into pieces. If you're happy Lena exposed the truth, hit the like button. What would you have done in her place? Comment below. Subscribe now. The next part will leave you speechless. Henry sat in his massive, dimly lit living room, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands pressed against his forehead. The mansion, once filled with laughter, music, and warmth, felt empty and cold. It had been just hours since Jane had been exposed in front of all their friends, family, and business associates. Hours since he had walked away from the woman he had once believed he would marry. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could he have been so blind? Had he really been in love with her? Or had he simply been in love with the idea of her? Everything felt like a cruel illusion. And now, as the weight of it all settled on his chest, he felt completely and utterly alone. The faint sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up as his mother, Lena, stepped into the room. She was no longer dressed in the plain clothes of a maid. She was his mother again, the one person in the world who had always stood by him, even when he didn't realize it. She sat down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I know what you're thinking, she said softly, and I know it hurts. Henry swallowed hard, his throat tight. I feel like an idiot. Mom. Lena shook her head. You're not an idiot, Henry. You have a good heart. And sometimes, when you have a good heart, you want to believe the best in people. Henry let out a bitter laugh. Well, look where that got me. Lena sighed. You're not the first man to fall for the wrong woman. And you won't be the last. But what matters is that you saw the truth before it was too late. Henry turned to her, his eyes filled with pain. I should have listened to you. Lena gave his hand a comforting squeeze. No, my son, you had to see it for yourself. And now that you have, the question is, what will you do next? Henry stared at the ceiling, his heart heavy. Everyone who had witnessed the proposal disaster had seen Jane for who she really was. But that didn't stop the humiliation he felt. The phone calls had already started, business partners checking in, friends whispering about what had happened, news outlets looking for a story. His world had shifted overnight, and he wasn't sure how to move forward. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. Lena tilted her head, watching him closely. Start by healing, Henry. The pain won't last forever. But if you don't deal with it now, it will follow you. Henry sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. I just don't get it. Mom, was she ever real with me? Did she ever actually care? Lena hesitated. Maybe she did in her own way. But Jane wasn't in love with you. Henry, She was in love with your money, your power, your name. The truth hit him like a slap. He had spent months believing he had found the one. And all along, she had been plotting to trap him into marriage for wealth and status. His hands clenched into fists. She was going to drug me, he muttered, his voice tight with anger. She was carrying another man's child and wanted to pass it off as mine. Lena reached up, brushing his hair back like she had when he was a boy. And she failed, because no matter how much someone tries to deceive, the truth always finds a way out. The days passed slowly. Henry threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the ache in his chest. But the betrayal had changed something in him. He began looking at everyone around him differently. Who was real? Who wasn't? Who would stand by him if everything disappeared? That was when he decided to test the people in his life the same way his mother had tested Jane. He leaked rumors that his company was on the verge of bankruptcy. He stopped flaunting his wealth. He even downsized his lifestyle, moving into a modest apartment and cutting unnecessary luxuries. And then, he waited. Slowly, the people he once trusted began to disappear. Business partners who had once praised him stopped returning his calls. Friends, who had been around for the lavish parties and expensive trips, suddenly had no time for him. And the biggest betrayal of all? His closest friend, James, the man he had known for over 10 years, walked away without a second thought. James called him one evening, his tone casual but distant. "Henry, man, I've been thinking," James said. "I need to focus on my own business right now. I don't think I can be involved with your company anymore. It's just too risky." Henry's jaw tightened. "So you're leaving?" There was a pause. "It's not personal," James said finally. But it was. It was very personal. As the call ended, Henry sat in the silence, realizing just how few people actually cared about him. Except for one. While everyone else had turned their backs, one person kept showing up. Emily, his secretary, the woman he had barely paid attention to for years. She had lost her job when the company collapsed. Yet she still checked in on him, brought him homemade food, offered to help him find ways to rebuild. She never asked for money, never expected anything in return. She was simply there. One evening, as they sat in his now modest apartment, Henry finally asked her, "Why haven't you left like the others?" Emily blinked at him, surprised by the question. "Because I care about you, Henry," she said simply. His heart stopped for a moment. "You care?" Emily smiled, a soft, genuine smile. "Yes, not for your money, not for your name, just for you." Henry felt something stir deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the rush of infatuation. It wasn't the blinding illusion of love that he had felt with Jane. It was something deeper, something real. And for the first time since the betrayal, Henry allowed himself to hope again. Days later, Henry came clean to Emily. "I lied," he admitted, watching her closely. "The company isn't bankrupt. I spread those rumors to see who would stay." Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't look angry. She just sighed and shook her head with a small smile. "You and your mother," she teased. "Always testing people." Henry chuckled, but then his expression grew serious. "You passed," he said softly. Emily tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Henry reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath hitched. "I mean," Henry said, getting down on one knee, "that I don't need any more tests." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I know who you are, Emily, and I know that you love me for me. Will you marry me?" Emily nodded, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Henry, 1,000 times yes." Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. And just like that, he had found what he had been searching for all along. Not money, not status, but love. The night was cold. The soft hum of the city filled the quiet space in Henry's penthouse. But inside, it was silent, too silent. Henry sat at the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together, his thoughts heavier than they had ever been. The weight of everything, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the realization of who truly stood by him, was crashing over him in waves. For the first time in years, he felt lost. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, seemed meaningless when he looked around and saw how few people truly cared about him. Money, power, success, he had all of it. But tonight, staring at his reflection in the massive bedroom mirror, he felt empty. Then, A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Henry? It was his mother, Lena. Her voice was gentle, but firm, the same voice that had comforted him as a child when he was scared of the dark. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the lump in his throat. Come in, Mom. Lena stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She was dressed in her simple nightgown, her face lined with both wisdom and worry. She had aged gracefully, but tonight, under the dim glow of the bedside lamp, Henry noticed something he hadn't before. She looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally, and that realization cut him deeper than he expected. Lena sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I know what you're thinking, she said softly, and I know how much it hurts. Henry let out a small, bitter laugh. I don't think you do. Mom, he murmured. I don't think anyone understands what this feels like. Lena turned to him, her warm eyes searching his face. You feel betrayed, she said. You feel like everything you thought was real, wasn't. Henry sighed heavily, his hands running through his hair. I feel like a fool, he admitted. I spent years building something that attracted all the wrong people. I let Jane into my life. I trusted James. I surrounded myself with people who never really loved you. Lena finished for him. Henry nodded, his throat tightening. Lena reached over, gently taking his hand. My son, she said, it is better to see the truth now than to live a lifetime in a lie. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lena took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. Henry, she said, her voice softer now. I need to tell you something. Henry turned to her, sensing the shift in her tone. Lena hesitated, her fingers tightening around his hand. I have spent my entire life making sure you had everything, she whispered. I worked day and night. I sacrificed. I did things I never imagined I would have to do, all so that you could have a future. Henry's chest tightened. He knew his mother had struggled. He knew she had worked tirelessly. But there was something different in her voice tonight, something he couldn't quite place. I never wanted you to feel the kind of pain I felt. She continued, the pain of being abandoned, the pain of being left to struggle alone. She paused, her eyes filled with a pain that had never fully faded. When your father left us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to give you a life where you would never feel that kind of loss. Henry's hands clenched into fists at the mention of his father, the man who had walked away without looking back. I have lived in fear for years, Lena admitted, fear that despite all my efforts, you would still end up trusting the wrong people. Fear that you would give your heart to someone who would break it. She turned to him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And Henry, she whispered, my greatest fear came true. Henry felt his breath catch. His mother, the strongest woman he had ever known, was breaking in front of him. And it was because of him. Because he had let Jane into his life. Because he had ignored the warning signs. Because he had been too blinded by love to see the truth. Henry's hands shook as he brought them to his face. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Lena shook her head, her grip on his hand firm. No, my son, don't apologize for trusting. Trust is not a weakness. But I need you to promise me something. Henry looked up at her, his heart pounding. Promise me, she said, that you will never let this break you. Henry swallowed hard. His mother had been through so much. She had raised him alone. She had faced rejection, humiliation, and hardship. And yet, she had never given up. She had never let the pain of her past define her future. And now, she was asking him to do the same. Slowly, he nodded. I promise, Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't let this break me. Lena smiled, a small, tired smile. That's my boy, she whispered. That night, Henry didn't sleep much. Instead, he sat on the balcony, staring at the city below, thinking about his mistakes, thinking about his mother's sacrifices, thinking about Emily, the woman who had stayed, the woman who had never once asked for anything in return, the woman who had treated his mother with kindness even when she believed she was just a maid. A warmth spread through Henry's chest as he thought about her. For the first time in a long time, he smiled, because he knew, without a doubt, that he had found something real. The next morning, Henry walked into his mother's room and kissed her forehead. I know what I need to do, he told her. Lena smiled knowingly. Then go do it. Later that day, Henry found Emily in her small apartment. She was surprised to see him, but he didn't give her a chance to speak. Instead, he walked right up to her, took her hands in his, and looked into her eyes. "Emily," he said softly, "I see you now. I see everything you've done. Everything you are." Emily's breath hitched. "And," she whispered. Henry smiled. "And I know now that I've been looking for love in all the wrong places." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "You're the one I've been searching for," Henry said, "and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Emily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't have to prove anything, Henry," she whispered. "I've loved you all along." Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never wanted to let go. And this time, he knew, this was real. This was forever. The warm glow of the evening sun bathed Henry's mansion in a soft golden hue. But inside the house, a storm was brewing. The revelation about Jane had left him shaken, but not broken. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. The betrayal, the deception, it had shattered something inside him, but at the same time, it had opened his eyes. For the first time in his life, he saw the difference between love and greed. Now, standing in the grand dining room, Henry knew it was time for the final confrontation. Jane sat across the table, her face carefully composed, though there was an undeniable tension in her posture. She had been caught. She knew Henry had seen her for who she truly was. And yet, she still clung to hope that she could manipulate him one last time. "Henry," she said softly, her voice filled with forced vulnerability. "I know things have been confusing lately, but I need you to listen to me." Henry folded his arms, his gaze cold and unreadable. "I'm listening, Jane," he said, his tone sharp. "Go ahead, tell me your version of the truth." Jane took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "I let my fears and insecurities take over. But I love you, Henry. I always have." Her voice trembled just the right way, her hands delicately trembling as she reached for his. But Henry didn't move. He just watched her, his expression unchanging. For a moment, Jane hesitated, realizing that her usual tricks weren't working. She had relied on her beauty, her charm, her ability to manipulate emotions. But for the first time, she was powerless. "Henry," she whispered desperately, "you can't just throw away everything we had. You love me, I know you do." Henry let out a slow, controlled breath. "I loved who I thought you were, Jane," he said quietly, "not who you turned out to be." Jane froze. The weight of those words crushed whatever final hope she had left. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. But Henry didn't falter. He had spent too long blinded by her lies. Too long believing that love was measured in grand gestures and passionate nights, rather than in trust, kindness, and honesty. "You were willing to lie to me, manipulate me," he continued, "and worst of all, you were willing to trap me in a life built on deception." Jane's breathing became erratic, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. She had been cornered, and she knew it. "You have to believe me," she pleaded, her tears finally real, but not because of love. Because of fear. Fear of losing the comfort, the luxury, the power. But Henry had made up his mind. "You were never in love with me, Jane," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were in love with my wealth, my status, my name." Tears spilled down Jane's face as she shook her head furiously. "That's not true," she cried. "I did love you. I still do." Henry simply stood up, and in that moment, Jane knew it was over. As Henry stepped out onto the grand balcony, the night air cool against his skin, he heard the soft steps of his mother. "Lena." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, my son," she said quietly. Henry let out a bitter laugh, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "Then why does it still hurt?" he murmured. Lena turned him gently, placing a warm hand on his cheek. "Because you are a good man, Henry," she whispered, "and good men feel pain when they are betrayed." Her voice was filled with understanding, with love, with the kind of wisdom that only a mother could have. "You opened your heart, and she used it against you," Lena continued, "but that doesn't mean love isn't real." Henry swallowed hard. "Then why does it feel like I'll never find the real thing?" Lena smiled softly. "Because you've been looking in the wrong places," she said. Henry frowned slightly. And that's when Lena said something that changed everything. Do you remember Emily? Henry's heart skipped a beat. Emily. His secretary. His most trusted employee. The one who had never asked for anything. Never tried to manipulate him. Never wanted more than to see him happy. Lena smiled knowingly. She was the only one who stood by you when the rumors spread. She said, when everyone else abandoned you. She stayed, not because she wanted something in return, but because she truly cared. Henry's chest tightened. He had been so blind. Emily had been there all along. Through every hardship, every painful moment, not because she wanted his money, but because she loved him. Henry rushed out of the mansion, his heart racing faster than ever before. He needed to see her, to tell her, to apologize. When he finally reached Emily's apartment, he hesitated for just a second before knocking on the door. A moment later, Emily opened it, her eyes widening in shock. Henry? She breathed. What are you doing here? Henry didn't wait. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she was the only thing that mattered in the world. Emily stiffened at first, but slowly, her arms wrapped around him too. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt at peace. I was blind, Emily, he whispered. I was so caught up in all the wrong things. I never saw you. Emily pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. Henry, what are you saying? I'm saying, he said, cupping her face gently, that you are the only one who has ever loved me for who I am. And I was too stupid to see it. Emily's breath hitched. Henry, she whispered, I don't deserve you, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Emily's lips trembled, and then, she smiled through her tears. Henry, she whispered, her voice full of warmth and love. You were always enough. And just like that, he knew. He had found the real thing. If you believe Henry finally found true love, hit the like button. What part of the story touched your heart the most? Comment below. Subscribe now for more heartwarming stories. The night air was cool and crisp. A stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside Henry. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped together, deep in thought. Everything had changed. Emily's kindness, her unwavering loyalty, the way she had stayed by his side through the darkest times, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. She wasn't like the others. She had never been after his money. She had never tried to manipulate him. She had simply loved him. And now, he needed to know if her love was real. There was only one way to find out. Henry had spent years building his empire, surrounding himself with people who only saw his wealth, his power, his success. But Emily had never cared for any of that. Or so he thought. As much as he wanted to believe it, the wounds left by Jane's betrayal still burned in his chest. He needed absolute proof. So he made a bold decision. The next morning, Henry summoned his personal assistant and instructed him to spread a rumor that his company had collapsed overnight due to a massive financial scandal. His assets? Frozen. His businesses? Gone. His wealth? Vanished. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. Friends disappeared. Business partners cut ties. People who once smiled at him now turned away. But there was one person he was watching closely, Emily. Would she stay? Or would she walk away like everyone else? By noon, the office was buzzing with whispers. Employees huddled in corners, frantic voices discussing the news. Some packed up their belongings, assuming the worst. Henry watched from his glass-walled office, his heart pounding in anticipation. Then, she appeared. Emily walked into the room, her expression calm but concerned. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask about money. She didn't run. Instead, she sat across from him, her eyes searching his face with genuine worry. Henry, she said softly, I just heard the news. Are you okay? Henry leaned back, studying her carefully. I lost everything. Emily, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The business, the assets, the properties, it's all gone. Emily's eyes softened. That doesn't matter, she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Henry froze. For a moment, he couldn't speak. You're not upset? He asked slowly. Emily tilted her head, confusion flickering in her eyes. Why would I be upset? She asked. Henry, money isn't who you are. I care about you, not your bank account. His chest tightened. Her words were so simple, yet so powerful. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't manipulating him. She had meant every word. Henry wanted to believe her. But there was one last thing he needed to do. I don't know how I'll survive this, he murmured, lowering his head. I can't even afford my own home now. I may have to sell everything. Even my car. Emily squeezed his hand. You'll get through this, she said confidently. Henry hesitated. What if I have to leave the city? He asked. Start over somewhere else. Would you come with me? Emily didn't even blink. Of course, she said, her voice steady. I don't care where we are. Henry, I'll be there. That was it. That was all he needed to hear. Henry stood abruptly, stepping around the desk and pulling her into his arms. Emily let out a small gasp of surprise. Henry, you passed the test, he murmured into her hair. She pulled back slightly, her brows furrowed. What do you mean? Henry took a deep breath, his heart racing. I didn't lose everything, he admitted. I needed to know if you were here for me or for my money. Emily's eyes widened in shock. You tested me? She whispered, her voice shaking. Henry winced. I had to be sure, he said quickly. Emily, I've been hurt before. I needed to know if you really loved me for me. A painful silence settled between them. Then, tears welled in Emily's eyes. Do you have any idea how much that hurts? She whispered. Henry's stomach dropped. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, guilt clawing at his chest. Emily wiped her eyes, taking a step back. I was willing to follow you anywhere. Henry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I stood by you when everyone else walked away. And you doubted me? Her pain was raw, palpable. Henry reached for her, but she took another step back. I need time, she murmured. And with that, she turned and walked away. Henry stood frozen, his mind reeling. He had been so focused on proving her love that he hadn't realized he had broken her trust in the process. Lena, his mother, entered the room, having heard everything. You were so desperate to find out if her love was real, she said softly, that you ended up hurting the very thing you were trying to protect. Henry swallowed hard. Have I lost her? He whispered. Lena sighed, placing a gentle hand on his arm. That depends on you, my son, she said. If you want to fix this, you need to show her that your love is just as strong as hers. Henry clenched his fists. He refused to let this be the end. That night, Henry drove across the city, determined to make things right. When he reached Emily's apartment, he knocked on her door, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily opened it slowly, her eyes still red from crying. Henry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, he said. I was a fool. I let my past cloud my judgment. I hurt you, and I will never forgive myself for that. Emily looked away, tears welling up again. Henry, I don't know if I can trust you again, she admitted. Henry stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. Then let me spend my life proving that you can, he said. Emily's breath hitched. I love you, Emily, he continued, not because you passed some test, not because you proved yourself, but because from the very beginning, you were the only person who ever saw me, not my money, not my status, but me. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. You really mean that? She whispered. Henry nodded firmly. With everything I have. Emily let out a soft, shaky laugh. Then let's try again, she said. Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. And this time, he never would. The sun dipped low in the evening sky, painting the city in hues of orange and pink, as if the universe itself knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Henry stood by the window of his penthouse, his heart heavy yet hopeful. It had been weeks since everything had come crashing down. Weeks since he had tested Emily's love. Weeks since he had almost lost her forever. But she stayed, even after the betrayal of his test. Even after the heartbreak, Emily had chosen to give him one more chance. And tonight, he wouldn't waste it. Tonight, he was going to make it right. The restaurant was elegant, dimly lit with golden chandeliers that cast a soft glow over the candlelit tables. Emily arrived, her heart pounding in her chest. She had told herself she wasn't going to expect anything. She had told herself she wasn't going to get her hopes up. But deep down, she knew. Tonight felt different. Henry stood as she approached, his eyes locking onto hers like she was the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Emily, he whispered, pulling out a chair for her. She smiled softly and sat down, still cautious, still guarded. Henry, she replied, A server came and poured them red wine. But neither of them moved to drink. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy stillness that carried everything they had been through. Then Henry took a deep breath, reaching across the table to take Emily's hand. "You were right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I let my fear of the past control me. I let my pain hurt you. And that's something I will never forgive myself for." Emily's eyes softened, but she remained silent, waiting. Henry exhaled shakily. "When I thought I had lost you," he continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, "I realized something. I wasn't afraid of being used. I wasn't afraid of losing money. I was afraid of losing you." Emily swallowed hard. "I love you, Emily," he said, his voice firm yet vulnerable. "Not because you passed my stupid test. Not because you proved yourself. But because from the moment I met you, you were the only person who saw me for who I really was. And I was too blind to see that you had loved me all along." A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek. "Henry," she whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily gasped, her heart pounding wildly. Henry slowly got up from his seat, walked around the table, and sank down onto one knee before her. Gasps and whispers filled the restaurant. But neither of them noticed. It was just them. Just this moment. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking with raw emotion. "I don't want to test love anymore. I just want to love. I want to spend my life proving to you that I will never doubt you again." He opened the box, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring, glimmering under the golden lights. "Will you marry me?" Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling. Tears spilled freely from her eyes. And then, she nodded. "Yes, Henry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes." The restaurant erupted in applause. But neither of them heard it. Henry slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, he knew, she was. The wedding was nothing extravagant, nothing lavish. Henry didn't want grandeur. He wanted intimacy. He wanted something real, something that reminded them both that love was never about riches. The ceremony was held in a small but beautiful garden, surrounded by only their closest family and friends. Kemi, his mother, the woman who had taught him everything about love and sacrifice, stood at the front row, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. As Henry stood at the altar, his heart raced, anticipation thrumming through his veins. And then, he saw her, Emily, walking down the aisle in a simple white dress, her face glowing with pure happiness. He couldn't breathe. How had he ever doubted this woman? How had he ever questioned her love? As she reached him, he took her hands, squeezing them gently. "You're breathtaking," he murmured. Emily smiled, her cheeks flushing softly. And then, as they exchanged vows under the golden sunlight, Henry knew one thing for certain. This was the greatest decision he had ever made. After the wedding, as the guests laughed and danced, Henry found his mother standing quietly by the rose bushes, watching everything with a tender smile. He walked over, his chest tightening with gratitude and love. "Mama," he said softly. Kemi turned, her wise eyes filled with emotion. "My son," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "You did well, Henry. You chose love." Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. "I almost lost it," he admitted, "because I let my fear control me." Kemi smiled knowingly. "Fear is a dangerous thing, my love," she said. "It can make us blind. It can make us push away the very people we need the most." Henry nodded. "But love," she continued, "true love, is worth every risk." He pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "Thank you, Mama," he murmured, "for everything." She squeezed him gently. "I did what any mother would do," she said. "I just wanted you to find what I never had, a love that's pure, honest, and everlasting." Henry's heart swelled. He had found it, and this time, he wouldn't let it go. As Henry and Emily left the wedding hand in hand, the stars twinkling above them like a promise from the universe, he whispered, "We've only just begun." Emily smiled, her fingers entwining with his. "And I can't wait for forever," she whispered back, because this time, love wasn't a test. It was a promise that would last a lifetime. The sun had barely risen when Henry stepped out of his car, the sleek black tires crunching against the gravel driveway of his mansion. The air was crisp, but there was no peace in his heart. His mind was racing. It had been a few months since his marriage to Emily, and the life should have felt perfect. Something was terribly wrong. A storm was brewing, one he hadn't seen coming. One that was about to change everything. It started subtly. Small things that didn't make sense. Numbers in his company's accounts that didn't add up. Money missing. Deals that should have closed. Suddenly falling apart. At first, Henry thought it was just a business miscalculation. But then, whispers began to reach him. "Have you checked your closest circle?" one of his old mentors asked him over coffee. Henry frowned. "What do you mean? Not everyone around you wants your success," the older man said, his voice low. "Sometimes the enemy isn't outside the walls, Henry. Sometimes they're sitting right at your table." The words sent a chill down his spine. But he brushed them off. After all, he trusted his best friend, James, didn't he? Henry sat in his office late one night, staring at the financial reports again. His company, the one he had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into, was losing money at an alarming rate. And there was only one common denominator in all the shady transactions. James, his childhood best friend, the man who had stood beside him when he built his empire. The man he had trusted with his life. His hands clenched into fists as realization hit him like a tidal wave. James had been stealing from him. For months, maybe even years. Betrayal burned through Henry's chest, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't believe it, but he needed proof. So he set a trap. The next morning, Henry walked into the boardroom, his face unreadable. James was already there, sitting comfortably in his chair, flipping through a contract like he had nothing to hide. "Morning, Henry," James greeted casually. Henry forced a smile. "Morning." He took his seat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished wood. "I called this meeting for a reason," he said, his voice calm, but inside, he was raging. James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's up?" Henry slid a thick folder across the table. James picked it up, flipping through the pages. His casual expression froze. One by one, Henry watched as realization dawned on him. The bank transfers, the shell companies, the millions of dollars missing. And all of it pointed directly to James. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Henry asked, his tone cold. James swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "Henry, I can explain." "Explain?" Henry let out a bitter laugh. "You've been robbing me. You've been taking everything I worked for, everything I trusted you with." James gripped the folder tightly, his eyes darting around the room. "Look, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think," Henry snapped. "I gave you everything, James. I trusted you more than anyone. And you stabbed me in the back." The room was silent. No one dared to speak. James looked down, his face twisted with guilt and fear. "You don't understand," he muttered. I was struggling. I thought I'd put the money back before you noticed." "You thought?" Henry's voice dropped, ice cold. "You didn't think about what this would do to me? To Emily? To everyone who depends on this company?" James looked away. "Get out," Henry said finally. James's head snapped up. "What? You heard me," Henry said. "You're fired. James, you're done." "Henry, please, don't beg," Henry interrupted, his voice sharp with betrayal and pain. "You made your choice. Now live with it." James stood, his face pale. But he didn't fight, because he knew he had lost. As James walked out of the room, Henry felt something inside him break. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. And James had destroyed it. That evening, Henry sat in his study, his head in his hands. He felt exhausted. But more than that, he felt alone. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Emily. She walked in, her face filled with concern and love. "I heard what happened," she said gently. Henry sighed. "I was so blind. Emily. He was my best friend. I thought he had my back." She came over, kneeling beside him, taking his hands in hers. "You're not blind, Henry," she said softly. "You're just good. You believe in people. That's not a weakness, it's your strength." His throat tightened. "But it hurts," he admitted. "Knowing someone I loved like a brother never really cared about me." Emily squeezed his hands. "He might have betrayed you. But look around you. You still have people who love you. People who would never hurt you." Henry felt tears burn in his eyes. But he held them back. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again," he whispered. Emily reached up, brushing his cheek gently. "Then start with me. she said. I'm not going anywhere. Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. As he did, he felt some of the weight on his chest begin to lift. Later that night, he visited his mother. Kemi sat on the porch of her small house, watching the stars. Henry sat beside her, letting out a long sigh. You look like a man carrying the world on his shoulders, she said softly. Henry nodded. Kemi was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. My son, she said gently, people will disappoint you, even the ones you love the most. That's life. Henry looked at her, his heart aching. How do you move past it? He asked. Kemi smiled sadly. You don't, she said. You just learn, and you grow. Henry stared at the sky, thinking about her words. Then he turned to her. I won't let this break me, Mama, he said firmly. Kemi nodded approvingly. That's my son. The next morning, Henry stepped into his office, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He had a company to rebuild. He had a future to protect. And he had people who truly loved him by his side. James was gone. The betrayal still stung, but it wouldn't define him. Instead, it would make him stronger. As he sat at his desk, ready to rebuild his empire, he whispered to himself, this is just the beginning. Because real success isn't about avoiding pain. It's about rising after the fall. And Henry? He was going to rise higher than ever before. The wedding bells rang out, filling the air with a melody of love, joy, and new beginnings. Henry stood at the altar, his heart pounding as he watched Emily walk toward him. She was stunning, not because of her dress, not because of the veil that framed her face, but because of the purity in her heart, the love in her eyes. This was it. This was the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing. The woman who had proven her love in the darkest of times. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. The right person isn't the one who shines when everything is perfect, Henry. It's the one who stands by you when the world turns against you. And Emily had done just that. The ceremony was held in a lush, open garden, decorated with beautiful white roses and golden lights that twinkled like fireflies in the evening sky. The guest list was smaller than expected. Henry had cut out the fake friends, the ones who only cared about his wealth, the ones who disappeared when he lost everything. Now, the only people in attendance were those who truly mattered. As Emily reached him at the altar, she took his hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Are you ready? She whispered, her voice full of emotion. Henry smiled. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The officiant began to speak, but Henry barely heard the words. All he could think about was how far they had come. From heartbreak to healing, from betrayal to trust, from loneliness to finding real love. When the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Henry didn't hesitate. He pulled Emily close and kissed her with all the love, all the passion, and all the gratitude in his heart. The guests erupted into cheers. The cameras flashed, and at that moment, Henry knew his life had truly begun. Later that evening, as the reception went on, Henry found himself sitting beside his mother, watching the crowd. Guests danced under the fairy lights. Laughter filled the air, and Emily was smiling as she chatted with her friends. Kemi, his mother, placed a hand on his. You did well, my son, she said softly. Henry turned to her, feeling a lump form in his throat. I wouldn't have made it here without you. Mama, she chuckled, shaking her head. I just gave you guidance. You made the right choices. They sat in silence for a moment before Kemi took a deep breath, her expression turning serious. Henry, she began, there's something I need you to understand. Marriage, it isn't about fairy tales. It's about choices. The choice to be patient. The choice to be kind. The choice to keep fighting for love, even when it's hard. Henry nodded, taking in her words. I've watched you grow, my son, she continued, from a little boy who had nothing to a man who has everything. But let me tell you this, wealth means nothing if you don't have love. Henry's chest tightened. His mother had sacrificed everything to raise him. She had been abandoned, she had suffered, but she had never let bitterness take root in her heart. And because of that, she had raised a son who knew the value of family, loyalty, and love. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. I promise, Mama, I'll never forget your lessons. Kemi smiled. Good. Now, go and dance with your wife. Just as Henry rose from his seat, an unfamiliar voice called out. Henry. He turned, his stomach tightening at the sight of James. his former best friend, the man who had betrayed him. James looked different now, weaker. His clothes were wrinkled, his face hollow, his eyes pleading. Henry's instincts told him to walk away, to turn his back just like James had once done to him. But instead, he stood still, waiting. James approached hesitantly. "Henry, I need to talk to you." Henry folded his arms. "You have 5 minutes." James took a deep breath. "I messed up," he admitted. "I lost everything after you fired me. The money, the status, the fake friends. And now, I realize, you were the only real friend I ever had." Henry stayed silent. James swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But, I wanted to say I'm sorry." For a moment, Henry felt anger rise in his chest. How easy would it be to humiliate James the way he had been humiliated? To laugh in his face? To walk away without a word? But then, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. The strongest man isn't the one who gets revenge, Henry. It's the one who chooses forgiveness. So, with a deep breath, Henry did the unexpected. He held out his hand. James's eyes widened in shock. "You're forgiving me?" Henry nodded. "Not because you deserve it, James, but because I deserve peace." James took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you," he whispered. And just like that, the weight of betrayal lifted. Because forgiveness isn't for the other person. It's for you. Years passed. Henry and Emily built a beautiful life together. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up with the same lessons Henry's mother had taught him. They gave back to the community, helping the less fortunate. And most importantly, they never let wealth define them. One evening, as Henry sat beside his mother on her porch, watching the sunset, he turned to her with a smile. "You were right, Mama," he said softly. Kemi chuckled. "About what?" "About everything." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I had to be. I was raising a king." Dear friends, what did we learn from Henry's story? We learned that love isn't about money or status, it's about loyalty and sacrifice. We learned that betrayal hurts, but forgiveness brings peace. We learned that a good mother's wisdom can shape the future of a great man. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment. What lesson stood out to you the most? Hit the like button to show support for Henry and his incredible journey. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that will inspire and uplift you. Thank you for listening. And remember, the strongest people are not the ones with the most money, but the ones with the biggest hearts.